Okay.
Thank you for your patience, everyone. Wouldn't be a really good webinar without a few technical difficulties, right?
Right. Evidently, the training document did not come up. Do you have that with you?
Sure.
Or
Do you want me to switch back to my screen?
Yes, for a second, because it's not popping up on my side.
Okay. Hold on just a moment. Mark, you let me know when you want me to switch back to you.
Okay. Go ahead and switch back to me now.
Okay.
Okay, it seems like I'm going to just have to pull up my document from over here. Okay, can everybody see my document with, oops, wrong one. Having trouble today.
Oh, I think everybody's had that experience before, right?
Yeah, let me see if I can close that. And okay, can you see my document at this point?
Yes, I can see it,
Okay.
Mark, so I'm going to go with the assumption, yes. Everybody in the chat box, yes.
Okay,
Yay.
great. Hey, sorry about that, everybody. Good afternoon, everyone. How are y'all doing? It's kind of funny to have a little glitch at the very beginning, but we can get going at this time. This part is part 2 of the internal controls, and we're going to be using Green Book standards as our process. And our agenda today, we're going to define internal control again. We'll talk about the Green Book and how it's organized in the sense that there's categories of objectives, components of internal control. That's what we're going to spend a good portion of time. And then the principles and attributes that go to those components. So a lot of the information is coming directly from the Green Book at this point. I thought it'd be easier to put it up on this type of screen and document so that you can just refer back to that instead of having to go back through a couple hundred of pages just to find the information that you need. So defining internal control is just it's a process for management to achieve the objectives of the entity or the organization, your organization. What do we mean by objectives? There's really basically 3 objectives that we need to do to operate, and that would be you'd have your operations, your financial reporting, and your compliance at the top of this cube. Those are the 3 kind of goals that we need, the objectives that we need to do for internal control. This slide is from TAASA model that provides how interconnected all of the subjects and processes are. So within each of the operations, financial reporting and compliance, you have what we call components of internal control, which would be then the control environment, risk assessment, controlled activities, information and communication, and monitoring. So those are your 5 components of internal control. And then finally on the right side of the cube would be who gets affected by internal control, which basically is the whole organization. It may be in different situations, might be just at the high level of management, could be depending on the size of your organization. You might have divisions or units or subsidiaries or programs in that situation, but that's where it goes into each of the parts of internal control. Now, internal control, again, to meet internal control, we need to meet these 3 objectives, which is operations. Operation is how you run your operations effectively and efficiently. Your reporting part, which is both internal and external, how do you go about having your good controls so that you can report either externally to your grantor or internally to your own people that you have, the board, let's say. And then compliance, which we need to do, especially with Green Book and with federal grants. Do we comply with all the applicable laws and regulations? Now, one of the things about internal control is how do you document that? There's a lot of different ways that you can do that to fit for the three objectives that you have. Some people will use flowcharts to show kind of the method and the process that goes on. That's a good way to show, internal controls by decision trees, other things like that. One of the main reasons that we use policies and procedures is naturally to affect the operations, but that's a very good way to show internal controls at your same time. Another way to also show internal controls could be your policy manuals. So you look at it in more of a holistic approach that each part helps each other. Now we're talking about internal controls. There's 5 components of internal control that feeds through each of the 3 objectives that we have. Again, they're controlled environment, risk assessment, controlled activities, information and communication, and monitoring. Well, as we put together those parts of our components, there's actually principles that will be used for each of the components. And as you can see on this table, there are different principles and different number of principles for each of the components. And you can see that a total of 17 by Green Book standards are the principles that we have. Now, one of the things that the principles help to define what you're doing in your controls, but there's also attributes that we'll be talking about at the same time, which is kind of getting a little bit more to the detail of the principles. So before we get into each of the sections, which is our control components, do we have any questions at this point?
Let's see, Mark, I don't think I'm seeing any right now.
Okay. Well, what we'll do is we'll go through each of the components of internal control, and the first one will be control environment. After we go through one of the components, we'll probably stop and see if there's any other questions at that point. So for the control,
just a reminder, everyone, you can use the chat box at any time. Please feel free, if the question comes up before we've paused for questions, I will keep track of anything that pops up, okay?
We will also have at the end of the presentation some time for questions. If you then think of some questions from the previous sections, we can always talk about that at that time too. So the first component of internal control is your control environment. To me, this is the most important part. It sets up how you set up your discipline and your structure of internal control and the quality that's involved. It provides the structure that you need to set up your processes at the same time. It also provides the attitude that you have that internal controls are important in that situation. So our first principle of internal control is demonstrating a commitment to integrity and ethical values. This is the most important part, I think, in this situation. If you're having an organization, if you have lax internal control or lacks of integrity or ethical values, it's really hard to lead by example and have your organization follow those kind of ethical values. The tone at the top really counts at this situation. That's one of our attributes that we have. The standard of conduct, that should probably be included somewhere, more than likely in your either part of your policies and procedures, but more than likely you would have that in your employee handbook. And then how do we adhere to the standards of conduct? You know, are you responsible, and you know, are there follow through in that situation? But without having the first part of the environment controlled and set, it's pretty hard to then demonstrate good internal controls and watching for anything that might happen later on. The second principle of internal control with the control environment is setting up the system. And in that situation, when you're doing the oversight responsibility, you're looking at who's going to be the oversight structure to that. Is that the board? Is it the management? How do you go about setting up your structure of what you're looking for? And then actually setting up the internal control system, which means then are we working through policies and procedures? Who's going to follow up on the policies and procedures? And what are we thinking about at that point? And then actually at the last part of that would be having any kind of input for when there's deficiencies. How do we define deficiencies? When do we expect something to happen? If it does happen, do we have a process to be able to bring it through the organization so that we can fix their deficiencies that happen within internal control? The third principle would be to establish the structure, assigning responsibilities across the board, and kind of the documentation at the same point. So in this organizational structure, part of that documentation could be your org chart in that situation. Who's responsible for what areas of the organization? And then within that could also be showing also the delegation of authority in that situation for the different processes that you have and the whole organization. And then you actually document the internal control through, a lot of times, through policies and procedures. Part of this is set at the very beginning, again, as in the control environment. So you may have a situation where, let's say on the financial side, somebody's providing the information so that you can then invoice your grantor. Well, who has that responsibility to do that? And then who actually has the authority? Who is that delegated? Is that delegated from the executive director down to the financial person, or is that done by the executive director, or is that actually really part of the board? So you look at this part, and so the control environment sets up a lot of your processes when you start looking at a high level. When we look at the principle 4 for control environment, now we're looking at kind of more HR issues. You know, how do we recruit our people? How do we develop them? How do we retain them at the same time? So part of that process when you're looking at the control environment is, well, are we doing that through job descriptions? That would be a good place to show expectation of competency. What are you looking for that particular position? And what are the expectations of that position? And then how do we recruit for that? Do we have, let's say, you're lucky and you have community college or other places that you might be able to recruit from there? Do you recruit from different websites or organizations like TAASA or TCFE? What are those kind of things that you are looking at the very top level part of controlling your environment? How do you develop your people? What are you looking for in the sense of training and processes to go across? And then how do you retain your people at the same time? A lot of this would be more developed by your HR, if you have an HR process to do that. And then succession planning. A lot of people will have turnover in key people. How do you develop that? Is that succession planning from within the process, or do you actually, your succession plan is that you're going to have to document how you recruit people for those high levels of key employees in that situation? Contingency plans, all those parts are part of the level 2 One thing that I remember about contingency plans way back for Y2K, when there was a big fear that all the computers were going to shut down because it wouldn't recognize the change to the 4-digit system and everything else. What was the contingency plan there? And there were always a lot of things that you could do. Did you back it up? And did you have that ready on a separate computer? What were you doing to kind of have your contingency at the same time? And this can be talked about with personnel at the same point. You know, what are our contingencies? When we have a situation that disruption of let's say funds from a funder at that situation. So this part can kind of, you can control it with your control environment by thinking ahead in those processes. Then finally, with principle number 5 would be, how do you go about evaluating and enforcing the process? So what is the performance part of it? Do we enforce accountability? What is the accountability in that situation? Would that be in your policies and procedures? Is it more within your employee handbook that there are certain things, code of conduct, where you may have, where you're accountable for something? This is how you kind of document those things so that people are taken accountable for their actions at the same time. We know people are going to have times where we make a mistake, but it's a part of, okay, when the mistake has happened, what do we do to fix it? Who is accountable to help correct the process in that situation? One of the things about enforcing accountability is also considering excessive pressure. Part of that process is if you're putting so much pressure on your staff for meeting goals that are not attainable, well, naturally there's going to be a process or things that people say, well, if I can't meet those goals, I'm going to fudge or I'm going to do something. Well, that weakens your internal control. So you need to consider those kind of pressures too. See how you can manage the process without applying so much pressure that then people are going to deviate because they can't meet those goals. Do we have any questions about the control environment?
Hi, everyone. This is Christina again. If you want to use the chat box, I can also unmute everyone if you would prefer, but I will just clue into the chat box for a minute if you have a particular question. We did have a question about the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint is available in the materials section. You should see somewhere above the chat box a place where we have uploaded the PDF of this PowerPoint if you want to take any notes. Okay, Mark, I don't see any questions at this time.
Okay. Well, the second part of internal control, the components of internal control, would be risk assessment. Risk assessment is now looking at the whole process. Where do you have a situation where you might have a risk? Some of those risks can be inherent, or they can be just from the process itself. So a lot of times you have to look at things in the structure. You may look at the process and the situation of your environment and the situation. If you're doing federal grants, well, do things change in the federal grant that might create a bigger risk at that point? One of those we could see right now is that changing from the OMB circulars to the CFR, it took quite a few years to kind of do that conversion. Part of the reason to do that is because we anticipated there'd be risk of non-compliance when you're changing from one set of standards to a new set of standards. That's something that you need to look into in that process. And then how do you manage those risks, both externally and internally? So the other part internally might be just this change in your organizational structure. A lot of this, like what we're doing with capacity building, there's the ability with, well, let's say the VOCA grants, when they go up at a much higher level of funding, well, naturally there's going to be more scrutiny. There's going to be things that happen. And internally, you need to kind of plan for the capacity of having more funds and what you do with those funds to ensure that you're in compliance. Another principle for risk assessment is kind of defining your objectives and also the tolerance to that. So in this situation, kind of defining the objective. Okay, one thing would be an example of that, defining objectives. Let's say the objective is to have your reporting of your financial reports in compliance and in good shape. One of those things is looking at defining what is that objective. Do you meet general accepted accounting principles? What kind of process do you have, and what kind of software do you use to do that? And then the other part is you define your objectives that you're going to then look for, that you may need to have policies and procedures later on with controlled activities. Then you need to look at the process and define your risk tolerance. Risk tolerance can be a lot of times in risk assessment, it might be high, medium, or low. So in that kind of situation, you may have a part that we manage risk, we don't eliminate risk. So there's times where you look at it and you say, it may be a risk, but it's low to me that I will actually go ahead and not add an additional compliance activity to it or compensating control, because I think it's manageable where we are. We don't need to bog the system down. So that's part of the process in risk assessment, is looking at your different areas and then finding out, first, what is your objective? Second, what is your risk tolerance? Now, a lot of us tend to be risk averse, so we say, well, we don't want to have any risk. I don't want to have any finding, but there is a point where, you know, if you're so conservative, and to that point, you might actually bog the system down. And so you need to find that balance of tolerance within that process. Objectives on that, again, financially would be, again, your financial reporting, your general ledgers, all the different things that you would do financially. On the opposite side would be your operations in the sense of programmatic. What are your objectives? How are you going to meet those activities and the process? And then what are their risk tolerance in that situation? Because one thing in programmatically would be your tolerance for, let's say, safety. What is your risk tolerance? If you have a shelter and you're looking at safety, how do you define that? Which will also help you to then set up your internal controls to meet those tolerances. As you identify the process on that, you'll start to look at things and identify, analyze, and response to risk. Well, identification of risk, what is that? Well, that could be a risk of, let's say, fraud, waste, and abuse. You found, you know, that's one thing that might be financial that you have identified. And that's one of the things that now with the TAASA FR is very highlighted. Used to be in the area of on the audit side, and it's now moved up to post award. So you need to identify, okay, what kinds of risks do we have there? Fraud, waste, and abuse is one. So what do we need to do there? How do we analyze that and analyze the risk? Well, there could be, let's say, in fraud, waste, and abuse, analysis of risk. You may have, how do we go about looking at fraud versus waste and abuse in that situation? And you may have to look at things a little bit different and analyze it. Well, is fraud really part of personal gain, or is it something like you have people going out and misstating financial statements for the betterment of the organization to make you look better? It's still a fraud issue, but where's the gain in that situation? Where's the risk of fraud in that part? And when you analyze that and you figure out what those risks are, then you can respond to it. And part of the response would be, naturally, in a good area would be your controlling the activities. Well, and one part of the control activities would be policies and procedures. So how do you set that up? Well, one of the ways to respond to this for fraud, waste, and abuse would be actually to put in a fraud, waste, and abuse policy. And how do you go about that? There are places where you can go where an employee can either go up the chain of command within the organization, or if they don't feel comfortable within that, does the policy show you where you can go outside? There's areas where you can go where there's a 1-800 number that goes to the state auditor's office, and they will handle some of that stuff, which will naturally, if they've get a request or on that kind of process, they'll send it to the local funder, and the local funder will then go back and look at that. So that's how you respond to your risk of fraud, waste, and abuse in that situation. But there are other ways of looking at risk and trying to identify them and then analyze so that you can respond. Well, here's the part of it that on our Principle 8 about access and assessing fraud, waste, and abuse. Well, the types of fraud. In this situation, like I said, there's personal gain, or there could be, so personal gain could be, well, if you have a, let's say, a petty fund and people are raiding the petty fund and not providing good internal controls, that's where some dollars can go. Now, the thing about it is with petty cash, how high of the dollars we actually have in that type of fraud, considering you may have the other type of fraud of personal gain. You may have an organization where whoever's involved in signing up procurement contracts may have an issue where they're getting money back from the contract from one of their vendors, kickbacks, things like that. So you try to identify what your fraud would be, the risk that you're going to have in that situation. That's why one of those situations of looking at the risk and everything, how do you then set up your response for fraud risk in that situation? So you can have a situation, let's say a board member has the ability or is a vendor at the same time. Do you have any policies that would then have conflict of interest? Those kind of situations, that's how you can then look at that and then eliminate some of your fraud risk, but also respond to those type of frauds. Again, looking at risk assessment, and one of the principles would be to analyze your organization with significant changes. That could be that you've lost some grants and now you're paring back. That could be a totally different type of risk versus you're really gaining a lot of grants now, and now your infrastructure has to be even more sound for compliance in that situation. You can identify that and the changes. Let's say a change that would happen here is, let's say you have you've been going around with $500,000 to $100,000 in awards, and now you're at $1.5 million of awards. Well, now you need to look at your risk that grants don't pay 100%. So at let's say 500,000 to $1 million might be a big change. That where are you going to get the extra dollars to pay for what the grant doesn't do, which means, you know, your unrestricted funds. So you need to kind of look at that in that process. And with the significant change, yes, we've grown an extra $1 million worth of grants, but how are we going to support that with our unrestricted fund? So that's where you look in identifying your changes and analyzing and responding to those changes. Do we have any questions on the risk assessment as a controlled process?
Hi, everyone. If you have any questions at this time for Mark, can you use the chat box? I could also unmute you. That is easier. I know a few folks were still looking for the PDF of the PowerPoint. I just sent in the chat box a Google link so that if you were having trouble accessing it, since I don't quite know how everything shows up on other people's screens. I've sent that in the chat box as well. Mark, I don't see any particular questions right now, so
Okay.
I think you're okay to move forward.
Okay, that sounds good. So now we've gone through the risk assessment. The risk assessment sets up where your vulnerabilities will be, and then how do you address those vulnerabilities at the same time so that you can improve and have good policies, procedures, your good process, you're efficient and everything. So controlled activities are really basically more of your policies and procedures. How do you then control each of the activities that you have in that situation? And what are those specific activities? So in that situation, you might have, let's say, code of conduct as one of your things. Well, is that addressed in your employee handbook? And have you responded to that process by using that as your documentation for any kind of risk of your employees with their code of conduct or anything else like that? You could have it for the process of, let's say, your financials and making sure that you're approving expenditures that are allowable at this point. What are those processes? So control activities, you start looking to achieve those objectives. So you need to look at your objectives and break them down into different parts. So you may have a situation where one of the things to do would be have your financial policies and procedures. Well, that fits one set of objectives. That's working, which most of us will have, is looking at our internal controls so that we can ensure that the expenses are correct and that they're allowable and that we don't have any audit findings in that situation. And we would have our policies and procedures for that. But then the other part of it is, well, what other parts of the organization do we need to look at our objectives? Are we providing the services we're supposed to do? And how do we do that within our organization? What kind of objectives, and then how do we then ensure that those are done? And that's what your internal control system will take care of, is that, okay, we know that there's services to be provided, there's somebody that's overseeing that part, and that we have a report that will help us to see that we're meeting our goals in that situation. Okay, one of the principles for controlled activities is just how do you design your activities and achieve the objectives. So in that situation, you've already developed a situation where you've seen a risk out there, and you see an objective that you want to do, let's say financial again, on the policies of financial statement. Well, what kind of risks do we have that the books and general ledgers are not correct? How do we go about that? So we might set up different controlling activities like policies and procedures. Who's allowed to be able to input the records, the financial records, and who's there to actually oversee the process. And in a lot of cases, it's making sure that you don't have the same person that's writing the check and doing all the transfers actually controlling the books and records at the same time. That's part of your segregation of duties. One of the things in here is your objective is, if you don't have the staffing to do that, well, how do you go about without the segregation of duties of different people handling those things? Well, you look at your design and your effectiveness of your activities. You may put in compensating controls, which mean a little bit more detailed policy or procedures, more procedures than policy, to ensure that you have good control over, let's say, the actual resources, the funds and everything that could be taken at that point, because there's that fraud, waste, and abuse of somebody actually having the ability to control the funds and also control the financial records that can either kite or move things around to where the fraud is not detected until way after the situation happens. In here, when you're looking at the process and defining the area, you also need to look at your information system. What is kind of your information, the entity's information system? Well, there's several different layers. One would be the entity itself. How do y'all operate? How do we operate in that situation? Just to work within our staff and everything else. Is that a web-based design? Do we have a web page that provides information to our stakeholders or to the outside or to clients and victims that need our help at the same time? So you kind of look at that process for those kind of things. You look at the controls that you would need, but at the same time, there's some areas that you might have. A good way of doing this might be you have an IT person and another group that will look at all of your software and other things that you need to manage your organization in that situation. Who's able to help you with Nauseam and other areas like that programmatically? Or if you're on QuickBooks, how do you go about that? What are those things that you need to make it effective in that situation? And then designing the security in your process. So let's say in your QuickBooks, who has the opportunity to go into QuickBooks or any other accounting system and change records? Are there audit features in there that shows when something is changed, who does the change or anything else like that? So those are part of your controlled activities that you have within that. Again, information is a very big thing in the process, and we've seen a lot of issues there that have happened, not dealing with the overall informational structure. So now that we're getting through a lot of the process of controlling the controlled activities, how do we document that? Well, a good portion of the time we're documented through policies and procedures. Well, when we document that, who are we documenting on the responsibility to make sure that the procedures are followed through? Is that a supervisor in a direct area? Is it for financial? It could be, the supervisor or the CFO or somebody involved in that. But that's how you start to document and set up your policies and procedures to ensure that it's being effective when you're implementing your policies and procedures for those process. And then at the same time, there should be a periodic review of the controlled activities, periodic review of policies and procedures. Is that once a year, or is it a situation that you may have documented that when something big happens, like major change in the organization or major change, let's say in your communications part, you have a new system that's a grant management system that helps you document a lot of your financial and how you set up to do your applications for your grants. That may be brand new, and now with that, do you need to set up a kind of policy and who is involved in that process so that you can ensure that there's good internal controls? Do we have any questions about controlled activities? Controlled activities can also, besides being policies and procedures, like I said before, could be a flow chart or a decision-making chart in that situation. I know when we were being audited by one of our federal agencies back at Texas Education Agency. We were still working through our policies and procedures and hadn't completed all of our procedures and our policies. And we were able to show that using our flow chart with decision making, that we had a good internal control system. It just hasn't been completely documented. And that's something that you can think about kind of in the controlled activities. If you're having a hard time or it takes so long to write those policies and procedures, maybe you can add just flowcharting the process and then having it approved, and then later on trying to work through and get that support documentation through the actual policies and procedures. So I guess we don't have any questions at this point.
No, we don't, Mark. Sorry.
Okay. No, that's okay. Just trying to follow through on a couple things, make sure that we can have time for this part. The Green Book is quite extensive, and we'll talk a little bit later on kind of over the overall part of Green Book. Okay, now we go to our information and communication, and there's 3 principles for that internal control process, which, you know, again, we're looking at how do we support our system. Is there an effective information and communication of the process? How do we go about setting up the objectives for those? Do we do it by, well, a lot of our policies and procedures now might be on the web, in an internal web instead of external. And is that the way we communicate? Or do we send things out by email? Kind of trying to figure out your system for information and communication. And then not only is that internal, but also external in that process. So you need to find ways to make sure that the information that you're providing is relevant and reliable, so that we can document to other people, but also to let people know what we're doing in the sense of transparency. One of the principles that we have in there is just the quality of information that we want to achieve. And what do we mean by that? Do we mean, you know, identifying the information requirements? Would that be where we're going to put the information out there? Are we being very conscious about specific information that we may not want out there, like Social Security numbers, other things like that, that could be a major issue? So when you're communicating the information and the information itself, how are we identifying that, and what vulnerabilities do we have? Again, that would be a risk that we would have in that situation, and then we would follow up with that process. The other part of that would be, what kind of data do we have? What relevant data do we have, and is it reliable? So in, let's say in a programmatic sense, our NASIM or other things like that, providing us good information on our activities and the process that we have, that we're meeting our own goals with services. And then the actual other part is then the data process itself, you know, the quality of the information. Where are we getting that information, and how are we going to capture that? Is that by different databases? Is it by spreadsheets? I know financially, a lot of times with QuickBooks, sometimes we need to go down to a spreadsheet and manipulate some of the information before we can actually then do asset, you know, allocation, expenditure allocation. So what is the quality of that information as you're providing all that data? Now, how do we communicate that throughout the entity, and what's the appropriate method for that part? One of the things in communication could be looking at your system again. IT might be one of the things that we might have. Do we communicate by email? Is that the best way for us to do that? Do we have a policy in that situation? Some organizations use kind of messaging. There's several different out there that will provide you that kind of stuff, where organizations, staff within the organization can actually message each other and provide good information back and forth. I know for us, we use Slack as one of the software out there, but there's a lot of other messaging processes that could be out there. So how do you communicate that process? Or are we still back at the point of sitting out and having everybody have their own hard copy manual of different things? Got to look at that process and see how appropriate your communications can be. That will help you tremendously on kind of the quality of the information. One of the other things you may look at also is, let's say, calendaring. How do you do you have an agency calendar that provides for different events that happen? Do you have a situation where you might have separate calendars for different segments of your organization, so that, let's say, a training group is quite often out on the road training and other things? Would that be on their calendar so that people know where they are and what they're doing, but how to ensure that the services are being met? Or do you want to composite all that into one big calendar? To me, that's kind of one of those issues where it depends on size of the organization and a lot of different things. How many people are actually out doing those kind of services might mean that if you're a very small organization, you might just use one calendar. But if you're a larger organization like that, you might have one that will be just for the different sections that you have in that process. So kind of looking at that internally, how do we communicate throughout the organization?
Mark?
Yes.
There was a question, is there, I'm a few minutes behind in asking the question, so, but
No.
is there any chance a sample policy would be available? Or, and so I'm not quite sure what actual policy,
Yeah.
but you might want to speak to example policies.
Okay. We have different policies that are out there that we have. One could be, let's say, travel. Just for a specific policy itself, you may set up the policy on travel. How do we go about that? The policy may be, do you have a review that somebody's providing information in advance for not even travel advance, but just to get approval of traveling to either, let's say, a conference or to do training somewhere or something, some area like that? You would need to have a policy that would set up that process. And then also within the policy, there are certain issues that can come up. One of the things that I know that's been big on one of the other agencies is that paying in advance for travel in that situation. It's hard to document. Sometimes it's hard to hold on to, and so you got to figure out, is it worth it to give advances, or can you find different ways to do that without developing a risk of non-compliance? So your policy and procedures would be there. So you may have an area where you document, let's say I'm going out to provide training to an organization. I would fill out a form to my supervisor, and the policy would state that, and it's now documented that he knows or she knows that I'm going out there, and it's okay on my grant to go out there and provide that. And then the second part of the policy would be, how do I get reimbursed? So you can fit into those kind of policies and procedures that way. If you're looking for more general and overall, I think it's best to contact me, and we can talk about either looking at your policies and saying, oh, I see this, maybe you need to beef this up, or you may need to look at certain things that you maybe haven't thought of in that situation. So for the almost a different process, you have to kind of think about it uniquely. I don't want to say it's transitional in the sense of one transaction meets this policy or procedure, but in some cases, it may be that situation where you could have a policy that says for let's say, expenditures may be very broad in that situation than nickel and diming for everything that you have. Hopefully that's helpful. If you have any questions about a specific policy or policies in general, you can always email me and I can work through the questions on that. Okay. And then for information and communication now, what do we have for external in that process? So how do we communicate externally to our people, our external partners, shareholders, well, our stakeholders, our federal grant agencies, other things like that? How do we communicate across the board, and what do we need to have? That's something that you would do with an internal control to ensure that you're not providing information that shouldn't be out there. As much as we want to do transparency, we also need to look at, the personal identifiable information so that that type of information doesn't get out and cause a risk to the person or to the organization in that sense. So when you're looking at information and communication as a control process, you need to look at that as a part of your process to ensure that you have an appropriate communication method. I think most of us all have a website where we share information or we provide transparency of what the organization's about. But it's always good as an internal control to look at that process and see what we may need to do in that area. So I've gone through the kind of information and communication. Do we have any questions in that area of internal control? Okay, what we'll do is now we'll go back to our last one, which is monitoring, which is a big phase. Monitoring, a lot of people think, well, it's a monitor coming in or an auditor or other things, but it's really, how do we ensure that things are being performed the way that we intended it to do? And then also, how do we align those when there are changes that happen, either change in the environment, change in kind of objectives in one sense. The environment might be that, we've grown so big that we've now had to change a lot of our process in one sense. We now have, instead of just everything is HR and financial in one area, now they've split up. Well, that's part of the environment. So what do we do there to ensure that enough information goes back and forth for the people to work with? Change in objectives. Like we did with TCFR, there were some objectives that we had to change in that situation. Grant-wise, let's say the procurement was a big area that changed, and how do we now impact that? Did we put that into our policies and procedures, or do we have a complete different objective now that we're not providing those type of services either through loss of grant or that the organization is now morphed in a different direction? And again, naturally, your laws, rules and regulations in that process. And then also to ensure that if there are any changes and we've had a deficiency, that we have corrective actions, and how do we achieve those for those objectives for deficiencies. So that's kind of what we're doing with monitoring. It shouldn't really be after the fact. It should be kind of, on a real-time basis, but it doesn't have to be, something that you spend so much time in that situation. But, you're just following through and you're making sure, okay, we know something's happened, the new laws happen. Okay, this is a good time to kind of monitor and see what's happened that's impacted to that new law that might be impacting our organization at the same time. One of the principles there is to kind of establish a process of evaluating the results. So one of the things to evaluate the result is establishing a baseline. So what is your baseline, let's say financially, that we had? Were we able, one of the baselines for, let's say, financial would be that there was anticipation that every month we close our books and we have kind of a financial statement available for the board to review. So you might have an income statement and a balance sheet, other things like that that provide kind of the information financially at that segment in time. That could be one of your baselines. Are we doing that, or are we so involved in the detail that we a lot of times slip and not meet that goal or that baseline? Looking at the system monitoring wise for that process, do we need to go back and re-review areas? One area that I would do if I'm going to be audited or have a monitoring, I would actually use this kind of monitoring process as kind of like a pre-monitoring engagement. I want to go back and internally monitor myself and see where my vulnerabilities before an auditor gets there. And then look at it and say, oh, well, here's some areas that we may want to shore up before they come. One area would be looking at policies and procedures. Did you have a fraud, waste, and abuse policy out there? If you don't see that, then maybe you want to kind of fix that before they come out there. But you know, you can provide that in a lot of different ways. It doesn't have to be at the back end, but you know, looking at your system for monitoring and that kind of part. I know financial people, we look at things with the books and seeing where we are with our balances and everything else year to date. That's kind of still part of a monitoring, because you're trying to see, are we efficient? Are we getting to a point that we're going to be over our expenditures, and where we're going to meet the goal to get those resources to make those expenditures complete in that process. And then evaluating the results, which evaluating would then be whatever the results are, how are we providing that to the organization? Is that just to, let's say, a section, let's say in the financial part, do we have a financial department, and do we only talk about areas that we've seen and just talk to that part of the organization? Or does that go up to management, or does it need to go to the oversight in the sense of your board? Some of those evaluations would be actually evaluating what is the appropriate place to provide those results. Sometimes it's better to have it, you know, result just within your section, let's say financially. Oh, well, we see that, you know, we need to improve a little bit here. Nothing big that needs to be sent up to management. That can be taken care of at the same time. So you're looking at those things. So those are the attributes that you look for when you're doing monitoring. When we go through the process, again, it needs to be timely in that situation. So a lot of times when we're monitoring, we're looking for kind of the efficiency or the effectiveness, the quality. And sometimes we'll need to issue a report to ensure that things are working correctly. If they're not, then definitely we need to issue a report. What kind of report? That could be just an email or a white paper or different things that will show that there's a deficiency. But one good part of looking at internal control is that you actually have a small deficiency, you miscategorized expenditure, but within that same month or the month after, as you close, you found that and you corrected it. Well, that actually, that shows that your internal control is actually working effectively in that process. Again, people are going to make mistakes. We're human and everything, but how do we ensure our internal control helps with that process? So, you know, issuing reports when we need to, what kind of report. It might be just a, oh, by the way, this happened, or it's a big oops and we need to report it up higher. And kind of that's part of the evaluating of the issue. And then naturally the corrective action that we need to do there. Corrective action can be, oh, we need to add another compensating control or a new policy, or really more new procedure could be part of the corrective action. So those are the things that you would do within your monitoring and to ensure that it's timely. That's all I have for today. One of the things, again, when you're looking at internal controls, there's a couple of things, especially when we're looking at Green Book. Under internal controls, it's a must that all of our organizations, we all have to have an internal control system. That's to ensure compliance and that things are working well and efficiently. Now, when we're talking about the very details, like we've been talking about throughout this part 1 and part 2, Green Book wise, that's a should. We should review the information. We should use that as best practices, but we're not required to. I would just think that when you're looking at internal controls, now with the slides and other information like that, you can go back and say, oh, I remember something about, the control environment. Have we actually looked at that? And more than likely, if you've been doing your policies and procedures and putting out information like that, good quality control, you've already hit most of the things that we have in here. I just want to just let y'all know that to remember, balancing is a big part of internal controls. Make sure that you get the must, which is you do have an internal control system and it works adequately for you, and that you're ensuring that you're doing reasonable assurance of your internal control, not absolute assurance of your internal control. And then just balancing your process, because again, anything that you work with in this process could be an additional cost. So it's looking at your internal controls holistically and how can we ensure that we're reasonably providing that assurance. Thank you. Any questions?
Yes, anybody on the webinar, I know some people were continuing to have trouble accessing the PowerPoint, but I've put a link to having it on Google, but I will also make sure after the webinar is complete that we email that out. When the webinar is complete, when we close down the screen, you should receive an email. I think it's automated for later today or tomorrow, and a webinar evaluation. We really appreciate your feedback. We want to make sure that these trainings are responsive to your needs. If there's a topic that you're interested in regards to financial capacity building, leadership capacity building, governance capacity building, whatever it could be, please feel free to use that evaluation tool to give us that feedback. We really want to make this a meaningful time for you, and we know that sometimes webinars are just the easiest way to do some training because traveling to and from is difficult. But please know that Mark and I can come to you at any time and do on-site technical assistance, sit with your policies and procedures. Mark does a lot of work on the phone, collaboratively, and in person. So, don't feel like you have to sit with all this information and with all of these policies in isolation, right? Let us support you in any way that we can, or connect you to the resources that can support you. Mark, is there anything else that you'd like to leave everybody with?
No, except that I look forward to seeing everybody at the conference. I'm always happy to visit with everybody.
Yes. Yeah, I hope those of you on the phone that are coming to the conference, we look forward to seeing in South Padre Island and connecting with you there. And for those of you who are not coming, please, we'll be thinking about you from the beach, and hope that maybe next year you can join us when our conference is back in Austin. All right. Thank you, everyone.